Seat. I'm still processing. I'm still processing. We found out earlier on this week, but thanks, Tim. Thank you. My name is Tim. I'm one of the pastors here at Kamloops Alliance Church. Not Tim Bussey, I'm another Tim. Somebody said the other day, does it ever get confusing at meetings when you two are both in the room? And we're like, yes. That might change moving forward, I guess. But so I'm one of the pastors here, and we've been working through the book of Ecclesiastes. And I was sitting down with somebody last week, and I asked, how are you doing? And they looked at me, and they said, it's so depressing. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, what's the point of all of it? I'm like, well, tell me more. He's like, well, we've been going through Ecclesiastes, and what's the point of all this? It just seems like it's so meaningless. I was like, well, we have been talking about that. But what I want to do is just take a step back this morning and just kind of maybe to kind of reevaluate. We're halfway through the series. It's a big series. But as the theologian Dwight Pryor says, this really does have this book has a sense of error and repentance and humility about it, doesn't it? It's kind of this heavy book. And so the author Solomon, being the author, he authored two other books, obviously, Song of Solomon and the Proverbs. The theologians believe that probably at the beginning of his life, that's when he authored Song of Solomon. I could probably let you guess why. I'll leave it there. And then probably halfway through his life, it was like the book of Proverbs, and those are the collection of wisdom literature. And so there's that makes sense too, right? He's growing, he's developing. And then we get the end of his life. And this book is one of those books where you kind of look in retrospection of your life. It's the old man kind of reflecting on the mires and rigors of life, the joys, the happiness, the heartache, the brokenness, the laughter, the vanity. Right? This is one of those things where he looks back, and I wonder when Jesus said this, he was thinking of Solomon. He says, what does it profit a man to gain the world and what? Lose your soul. I wonder if that's what Jesus was thinking about with Solomon. What does it gain a man to gain the world and yet lose his soul? And so it does seem kind of hopeless, but I want to say to him, actually want to push back on that and say that Ecclesiastes isn't a book of hopelessness, but rather as of hope. You see, what Solomon is doing is he's giving a universal kind of wisdom. And what he's doing is he's setting up the argument, if you will. We've been talking about being under the sun. And the idea of being under the sun, it's an idiom, it's a Hebrew idiom, and it means everything that we know of in existence, right? Everything on earth, everything we experience, that's under the sun. But here's the cool point, is that actually God sits above the sun. And so when God sits above the sun, everything that's meaningless under the sun all of a sudden becomes meaningful. What was once meaningless, when you put God above the sun, above everything else, what is meaningless is now actually meaningful. And so what he is doing, he's actually drawing a contrast through this entire book. And he's saying, this is what it's like when it is without God, but this is what it's like with God. And so we're halfway through this series, and we're saying, what is it like to not have God? That's what we're in the middle of. And that's where we land today. So, having said all that, we land today of the toil of vanity. The meaningless of work. And I kind of want to give you, there's two different ways of doing a sermon. You can either kind of let people walk them through a theory, or you can kind of, at the onset, kind of tell them what you're going to talk about. And I'm going to kind of give you the spoiler here. And the spoiler is this. It's the myth, the heartbreaking myth of the secular and sacred work. And that there's a hierarchy between intellectual and physical work. That's what we're going to unpack today. So, we're going to start in Ecclesiastes. We're going to go to 2:18. Let me read it. Why don't we stand? Why don't we stand for this part? And this is what Solomon says in reflection on his life, talking about labor. He says this, thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I labored under the sun. For must leave it to a man who will come after me. And who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool, yet will have control over all the fruit of my labor which I've labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore, I completely spared of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom and knowledge and skill, and he gives his legacy to the one who has not labored with him, this too is vanity and a great evil.
For what does it gain a man in his labor and his striving, for which he does all the laboring under the sun? Because all the days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. There's nothing better for a man than to eat, drink, and tell himself that labor is good. This also I have seen from the hand of God. Why don't we be seated? Please be seated. So we start at, now I got to warn you, there's going to be 2 Hebrew words I'm going to bring at you. Don't lose me. I just hang in there with me. I just need to walk you through because this kind of sets up the whole argument. So hang on, work with me. So this, I have hated all the things I have toiled for. I've hated. You know what that word means? It's the word sin, and it means hated. I despise it. I hate it. I despise it. All the things I have toiled for. Now, this word toil is actually the word amel. If you go to Genesis 3:23, where God says you will have to toil the soil, right? After the fall, it's man has to toil in the sweat of his brow. That word is of the same ilk, is of the same family. It's the word abal. So it's all within that same kind of genre of words. Work, toil. But that word abad is this sense of this sense of compelling, of bondage, of having to work. And so we always just think that saying that it's part of the fall, and so we must work because of that. And so if we have to work, the logic is, if we have to work, if we must work, if we've been kind of cursed to work, then you might as well make it worth something, right? So if I'm going to make it worth something, then if I can't find any value in my wealth, or if I can't find any value in the things I could purchase with it, maybe then I can do it for some intrinsic value beyond myself, i.e. maybe I can do it for my kids. Maybe I can pass on my inheritance. I can work really, really hard so my kids have a better life. And I'm not opposed to that because I'm a product of that. My parents came to Canada in 1989 for that very reason. And here I am. It's amazing. It's a blessing. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to do that. But when that becomes the focus, it is meaningless because I must leave it to them. And who comes after me? And who knows what they're going to do with it? Who knows what they're actually going to do with it? Right? Have you ever heard the term shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve in 3 generations? Or my favorite, clog to clog in 3 generations. It's the idea that within like 3 generations, all the inheritance, everything you passed on to them actually disappears typically. In other words, within 2 generations, everything you pass on, 70% of it is gone. Within 3 generations, 90% of the wealth you've passed on in your inheritance is gone. Right? So there's this idea like, who knows what they're going to do with it? And so you've worked and labored all your life, and now all of a sudden there's insult and injury because who you've worked for now, who knows? Who knows whether the person will be wise or foolish? This too is meaningless. All right, so we carry on. For a person may labor with wisdom and knowledge and skill, and they must leave it all to their own who has not toiled for it. This is meaningless as well. You come into the world, there's an expression, you come into the world grasping your hands, ready to conquer the world. And then you die with your hand open, realizing you can't take anything with you. Right? It's this idea that you can't take anything with you. And your heart despairs, for this too is meaningless. What people get for all the anxious striving with which they labor under the sun, all their days they work in grief and pain, and at night their minds do not rest. Later on, the author says, God's put eternity in the heart of man. Our minds do not rest, and so we despair as something evades us. And so when you go to work, what is the reason that you're doing it? Are you trying to find the intrinsic value to make at least, if you have to go to work, you might as well do it for a good reason. I might as well do it for my kids so my kids have a better life. Or pass it on to my children, or do it for philanthropic reasons, or whatever the reasons are that extend outside of you. But whatever those reasons are, my question is, are they actually fulfilling? And are they actually doing what they're supposed to do? Are they actually meaningful? But the author gives us a bit of hope that we can make it meaningful. That worship and work are actually really, really tied. Let me explain. Verse 24. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This word toil, okay, we just talked about, right? It's the word abad. Hang on with me. Okay, word abad. This word abad is, yes, indeed found after the fall. So Genesis 3:23, we find it in the fall. You must labor and toil. We get that, okay? But it's also found in Genesis 2:15, which means it's actually found before the fall, which means that actually laboring and toiling is not a bad thing. We were actually designed to labor and toil. You with me? We're actually designed to labor. That is what we were do. We were tasked to take care of the garden, to labor and toil. Great. But let me take it one step further. You ready? There's the big one. It's coming. If I take it one step further, the word abad is found over like 250 times in the Old Testament. And yes, indeed, it's meant to describe toil. But at the same time, it describes worship. What am I saying here? What I'm saying is that the word work and the word worship are the exact same thing. Not closely tied, not somewhat connected. When you work and you also worship, they are one in the same thing. We are a product of our Greco-Roman culture, which is a great thing, by the way. We have sciences and math, and we have like all these biology words that none of us can say or understand. Don't kid yourself, none of us can. But like we're a product of this Greco-Roman culture, and it's given us many, 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 many great things. One of the shadow sides of that Greco-Roman thinking is the philosophy that creates a dichotomy. It's a philosophy that creates a dualism between the secular and the sacred. And it says such a thing that there is such a thing as secular and sacred, and that is a foreign concept to all the writers of the New Testament. James, Jesus, Paul, well, Jesus didn't write it, but you get what I mean. That was a foreign concept. There was never this idea of dualism where you had work and worship. Every one of those writers, when they talked about work, they talked about worship. It was one in the same. And so over time, we've created this unintentional segregation between the secular and the sacred. We put a utilitarian type focus on our work. We nearly put in the time, and yet the Apostle Paul makes no distinction. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 10:33, he says, whatever you do, do it what? Let's try it again. Whatever you do, God, do it for the glory of God. Whatever you do. You see, we bring glory to God by the very privilege of work. Let me explain. When you work, inherently, you're serving. Think about it. You go to work and you serve somebody and you exchange your time and they pay you and you give them time. And what? You both walk away winning. You both walk away better as a result. And when you serve somebody, you serve mankind. And when you serve mankind, God delights and you worship. Work, worship, serve. These things are good. It is good to work. It is good because it brings order to chaos. It brings shalom. It brings peace on earth. This has been the calling God's had for us from all the way from Abraham, is to bring shalom, peace to the earth. And when you serve somebody, and you serve somebody well, and you do a job well done, that brings peace. And that draws men unto God. Why? Because you are a light and salt. When you do your job well, you serve well. And when you serve well, you bring glory and honor to God. Ephesians tells us that He is our peace. And then Paul flips it around and says, and you are called to establish peace. That is our job, to establish peace, to attract others to God. Stackhouse has a brilliant book talking about work, and he has this quote, and I just think it puts a point on it. Each person is called by God to play a particular role in the gardening of the world. No one is useless. No one is free of responsibility, and each is called to the generic task of contributing shalom or peace. And so as you go into work tomorrow morning, do you see it as a necessary evil, right? Do you see it as something that you have to do? Is it part of running the treadmill? Or how can you redeem that work and bring worship and honor to God in what you do? Show up early. Work hard. Right? So when I drop off James in the mornings, I just drop, I tell him two things. I say, I love you, and I say, come home tired. Leave it on the field. Leave everything you got on the field or at your job when you do it. Work hard, because when you work hard, you bring glory and honor to your boss, which then ultimately gives and trains you to give glory and honor to your heavenly boss. Work hard. This whole culture of silent quitting is not biblical. You work hard and you do your job well because you're asked to do it well. And when you do your job well, and when it becomes a commission of God, here's the second point. Now all of a sudden there's dignity in the work that you do. There's dignity. So every year my family somehow decides that we're going to do a massive project in our yard. And when I say my family, actually it's not my family, it's me. And usually it involves like some type of machinery, i.e. a hoe or something like that. And I'm good enough to be dangerous, right? I'm good enough on a hoe to be dangerous. I can make holes, I can move dirt, I can put pipes in the ground, I can move dirt back again. It's not pretty, but I've got hydraulical history, so I can do it. I can make it happen. But this year, the project we have is massive. And so I called my friends and said, hey friends, can I borrow your hoe this year? And they're like, absolutely, for sure, come get it. Yeah, for sure, you can use it. I said, great. But I need a guy with it this time. And they're like, why? I said, well, I think I'm over my head on this one. No problem. So my friend Sam comes down, and Sam and I spend 2 days together. I'm holding the transom, and he's carving and shaping, and I mean, it's fairly big. Like, we've got 3-foot bucket, and we're kind of shaping the ground and making it all work, and we have to get within like 1/4 of an inch over the sides of the sanctuary. Like, it's impressive. But I'm over my head, so he's coming, he's helping me, I'm doing my job. And so as we're going through this process, I'm just impressed. Like, have you ever seen somebody do their craft so well that you're like, they're good, right? That was my friend Sam. Sam, he was like amazing. I was like, you're good, I'm not. And so we're going through this day together, a couple days, and I said, Sam, thank you so much for the work you did. You did amazing. He's like, oh, no, you could have done it. And I'm like, oh, no, you're amazing. He's like, oh, no. And so we did the Canadian thing back and forth, like, no, you're better. No, you're better. And so anyway, we're talking, and then we get to the conversation, and we're talking about the summer, and he says to me, what are you doing? And I say, well, I'm going to go study at the end of the summer, take my master's. And he looks at me, and he says, oh, smart guy stuff. My heart broke. Because what my friend Sam had done at that very moment was I was going to do smart guy stuff. I was going to do intellectual work. He's just a hoe operator. And I said, don't you ever say that again. You see, what Sam did was good work. What he did was good. I watched him. I couldn't do that work. But it honors God, and it is good work. And so as much as there's no dichotomy between the sacred and the non-sacred, there's also no hierarchy between intellectual work and physical work. Both are good, and both are needed. You see, when a rabbi or a teacher would come into a carpenter shop, somebody who, intellectual would come into a woodworker shop. Let me put a point on it. When Jesus walked into a woodworker shop, the woodworker didn't have to put down his tools, because it was understood that what the woodworker was doing was no less of importance than what the rabbi did. You see, sometimes I get the feeling that we create a dichotomy, don't we? We have physical, we have intellectual, and there's a range. And I think often what we do is we say, you know what? That's the work we ought to strive for. This is just the mundane how to get there. There's sanctity in the balance of work. Both are important. Both are needed. Work is part of the profound design. I mean, God himself is the creator, the builder, the fabricator, the beautifier. He's the organizer. God himself worked. He is both. He is both the intellectual and the physical. And both are good for the soul. You see, I think often what we do is put ourselves in some sort of a camp, don't we? We're like, well, I'm the physical guy. I pull wrenches, or I'm a plumber. That's my thing. I don't do the intellectual type stuff. Or we're the intellectual kind. I don't change the oil in my car. I don't do that. Or the door handle. That's not my thing. I'm more of a, can I just say, not only does the body need both, not only does our society need both, but you need both. You need both. In other words, when you've been swinging a hammer all day and you've been pulling wrenches all day, great, thank you. The work you do is amazing and important. Hear me. The work you do is amazing and important. And when you come home, you need to stimulate your mind. You need to read. You need to study. That is a good thing. On the flip side, if you're all day, you're leading and managing people and you're strategically thinking and you're in the intellectual realm or the theological realm, great, thank you. We need the work that you're doing, but you need to get your hands dirty. You need to get your hands dirty because it's atrophy of the soul if we just compartmentalize ourselves in one or the other. Both are good. Both are part of our common good of what we need to do. It gives a sense of value to not only to others, but to ourselves. I think there's one more layer to this. I was talking to Chris. I'm like, I know how I'm going to do this. We'll see how this goes. But there's one more layer to this. Call it a detour. Excursia, right? Excursia, is that what? Let's take a detour for a minute. As you know, I'm a pastor. Have been for 3 years, or however long it's been. And church, by the way, thank you. Thank you for the trust, for allowing me to serve that way. That means a lot. But my history comes from both these spaces. I come from the physical world. So I've been on the rig floor at 3 a.m, pulling slips, pulling pipe, sweating, running. I've done that work. I've been a welder, pressure welder, crawling underneath a pipe and trying to, if anyone in the room is a welder, I hate 60-10 rod. Only a welder would know what that means. So I get that world. I even hung drywall for a season. I've done that work. I've also done this work, where I've managed, I've started, and I've kind of dabbled in this area and worked in this area, and I'm currently kind of predominantly in this area. But can I say something? I've got the role of pastor. Can I be very clear with you for a moment? I haven't arrived. As a pastor, the title pastor, there's this feeling sometimes I think we get where we say, I only do these things so that one day I could be in ministry. So I could support the ministry, I could support the important work of ministry. What you do is important, and I want to lift it up and say it is all sacred. It is no different. Your job is no more or less important than my job or the person next to you. It is part of the kingdom work, and it is all good. And it is all important, and it is all sacred. He is pleased with all of it. If you're an administrator in the room, you organize things. Thank you. Your work is good. If you're in this room and you're a gas attendant, thank you for the work. Your work is important. If you're in the room and you cut hair and you're a barber, the work you do matters. If you're in the health profession, thank you for the work you do. If you are in legal work, thank you for the work you do. These things matter. What I hope to do this morning is to say, whatever it is that you do in this room, I want to lift it up and say, thank you. It is a good thing. Delight in serving God. And this dichotomy of this intellectual and physical, can we just agree that that is not a healthy thing? Can we agree that there's honor and dignity in all the work represented in this room this morning? You see, I'm in ministry now, and that's great. Amanda and I feel called to ministry. And so we're stepping into ministry. And that delights the heart of God. But not because we're going into ministry. What delights the heart of God is because we're obedient. And that's what he calls you to be. What is he calling you to be and to do? And are you obedient in that? And whether you're a woodworker, or you're a rabbi, or you're a barber, or you're a mechanic, the question is, are you obedient? Are you doing what he's asked you to do? All the work we do is sacred. It's all anointed, and it has eternal impact. And when we approach it in that light, guess what? Now there's joy. Now there's joy in the work that we do. We go back
Where am I going? Where am I going here? Oh, 25. Thank you. There you go. Find oh. You know, I actually sat and fought this thing for a few minutes yesterday. Okay, satisfaction. How about that? There is satisfaction in their own toil. In verse 3, I want to read in the next chapter, verse 3. Won't get to. I'm taking away part of Chris's sermon next week. But in chapter 3, he says this: I know there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do the good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in his labor. It is a gift from God. Here's the trick. You've been wanting to enjoy the fruit of your labor. We have fruit trees in our yard. I come from northern Alberta, northern British Columbia. There are no fruit trees in northern British Columbia or northern Alberta or Regina. There's crabapple trees, but those aren't apples. I don't care what you say. So I now live in Kamloops, and there's pears, and there's cherries, and no, we can't get the peaches to go, but there's a bunch of fruit in our yard, and my wife or my father-in-law, they tend to that fruit tree, and the fruit that comes to that is amazing. So I have a full appreciation now for what it means to have good fruit. But it's actually not in the pursuit of that fruit that we get to enjoy. It's actually in the service and in the obedience to God that we get the very thing our heart desires, which is the fruit. And so this is the irony, is that you were chasing the wind to eat the fruit. But it's actually in pursuing God that you get to now enjoy the fruit, the satisfaction in the toil. This is from the hand of God. This is from the hand of God. This is a famous quote, but I just thought it was so good. A baby feels hungry. There's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. I find myself a desire which no experience in the world can satisfy. The most probable explanation is I was made for another world. If one of my earthly pleasures satisfied, it does not prove that the universe is fraud. Probably, and get this, probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. The real thing. You are called to be obedient and to serve. So the work that you do, is it a necessary evil? Right, the treadmill. Freedom 55, the sooner I get to work, the better I am. Right, the sooner I can retire, the better off I am. Or is this a moment where you can actually serve God and bring peace and shalom and actually draw people to God by the peace of working hard, honoring God, and being salt and light? You see, when we do that, when we draw people to God, it's as a result of that we get to enjoy things like baptisms. That is the end goal, so that people have a story of how God changed their lives. And we do that by acknowledging God and drawing people unto ourselves. And so later on this afternoon at 12:30, we're going to go do the baptisms. And so we're going to watch some baptismal videos right now. They're condensed, shortened versions. Online, there's the full version of it. And you've got a pamphlet, which the story is on them. But church, when we do what we're called to do and we're obedient, this is when lives are changed. This is when baptisms happen. This is when God gets the glory, when we're obedient. Let's watch.